identity and buy into a more cosmopolitan shared identity. Another possibility is intensification. In this situation, what we find is the jamming together of individuals of different ethnic groups into a single urban polity works to exacerbate those differences so that individuals seek markers of their ethnic identity to remain their distinctiveness relative to other members of that urban population. And the third is a process of stabilization, whereby we see a long-standing continuity in cultural markers of ethnicity over time. Now let's look at the Indus civilization. We find evidence of coordinated city planning. We find regularity of brick dimensions, the 1, 2, 4 that Mark talked about. We see systemized weights and measures. So what then could we hypothesize about Indus Valley reactions to urbanism? Do these practices bespeak integration, intensification, or stabilization? To my mind, what we see is efforts to integrate culture from one urban center to another, an absence of social stratification, and institutions that were in place for integration of ethnic groups. If this then is the case, we cannot explain the unique affinities of the Mohenjo-Daro skeletons as simply those of conservative local potters. Instead, I would contend that the Mohenjo-Daro alleged massacre victims are, in fact, non-local intruders. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hemphill. So now I would like to invite next speaker, Dr. Brad Chase.
Yes.
Yes, please.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me. A special thank you to Dr. Lashari for organizing this conference, and to all of you for being here to hear me talk about transformation and resilience, social change and agricultural practice of the Indus civilization in Gujarat, explored using animal bones and biogenic isotopes. It's a long title. It's a wordy title. But what I'm going to be talking about is the changes at the end of the Indus civilization and how everyday people managed those changes. I'm going to be talking about how everyday people managed changes at the end of the Indus civilization in the region of Gujarat, south of here. Now, that makes my paper a little bit different than the other papers today that have been focused on Mohenjo-Daro, but what I'd like you to think about while I'm showing you my work is the way that this can be applied here. Everything that I'm talking about here can be done with materials from Harappa, from Mohenjo-Daro, from the new excavations at Chandhu-Daro, and other places. So I first have to begin by thanking all of the organizations that have supported me in my work. This is a collaborative project that has involved a lot of organizations and individuals, and I'm not going to read through all of these. Rather, I'm going to move on to where we are. Specifically, the region of Gujarat, south of here, the southernmost extension of the Indus civilization. This is the time period during 2600 to 1900 BC is the time that Mohenjo-Daro was most well developed, when the Indus script was in use, when weights and seals circulated throughout. And then there were dramatic social changes. As we heard Dr. Knoyer earlier today, this does not mean complete abandonment of settlements, but rather changes. People use the land in a different way. If I zoom in now to Gujarat, we see something of variation on that theme. There's change, but there's also continuity. I'll be talking about data from 3 different sites. 2 sites were occupied during the integration era, the time of the writing and the seals and Mohenjo-Daro being most active. And the 3rd site is a site called Jaidak, which was occupied during the localization era after people stopped using the writing systems, stopped using the seals, etc. This is a really important time. It's increasingly accepted that there were changes in climate at this time. Specifically, recent research in Haryana, India, has indicated that there was a decrease in the strength of the summer monsoon at this time, and that corroborates with other sources of data that I'm not going to talk about in great detail from areas surrounding the region from Tibet to Oman. Now, before you presume that I'm going to tell a story of environmental change leading to social collapse, I want you to think differently right now. And here I'm following Dr. Marco Medella, who spoke earlier today. 10 years ago, wrote that a climatic event cannot be blamed simplistically for collapse and deurbanization. Rather, we must address the social processes at the level of individual agricultural communities that engaged with these environments. That is to say, climates change. That's what they do. Farmers adjust. That's what they do. And what we can do is try to understand how that happened in a particular place. So my research questions in Harappan, Gujarat have to do with the livestock economy, how people raised cattle, sheep, goats, and how they adjusted to a changing climate during this period. Faunal analyses, that is the study of animal bones that are excavated from archaeological sites. This can tell us how people raised their animals and why they raised their animals. And then biogenic isotopes. These are isotopes that are incorporated into tooth enamel as an animal grows from the environment. These can tell us about what those animals were eating during the first year of their life while their teeth formed. And it can also tell us where they lived. In this way, we can monitor how people raised animals, what they were eating, and where they were moving around during this period of social and climatic change. And that's enough with the words right now. This is the material. Animal bones are not necessarily pretty. I can say that because Dr. Meadow is in the other room. They're ugly, but they're durable. They preserve very well. And at most archaeological sites, they're the second most common artifact apart from potsherds. There are a lot of bones from every single site that's excavated. That means that we can do this kind of analysis from every site that's been excavated here. Now, by counting and classifying and identifying different fragments of animal bone, we see some interesting things. This is a very simplified presentation of what kind of animals were being consumed for food at these three sites. And one thing to take note of here is that there were fairly significant differences between two small Harappan settlements that were only 20 kilometers apart from one another. Right, this is an indication that there were some important social differences that are during the integration era. Looking at the data from JIDOC from the localization era, it matches close with one of them. But what we do not see is a clear change through time. There is enough diversity within the integration era that we cannot say there was a simple change from one pattern to the other pattern during the localization era. So that's point one. It's complicated. But now I'd like to show you some of my favorite bones. And those are the teeth. I love teeth from archaeological sites. This is a goat's jaw. And I can tell that because the teeth allow us to distinguish species. The wear patterns on the teeth allow us to determine the age of the animals when they were eaten. And the tooth enamel is what we use to do the chemical analysis on. From these archaeological sites, I've recorded the age at which the cattle and the sheep and the goats were eaten, and we can determine that at all three of those archaeological sites, the cattle were kept until they were really quite old. I'm not going to bore you with the details of how that chart works, but trust me, it demonstrates that more than half of the animals were very old before they were consumed for food. That suggests they were kept alive for milk and for traction and as a source of wealth. That makes a lot of sense. It's comforting that it makes a lot of sense. That's the way that people raise cattle today in the region. Turning to the sheep and goats, so mostly goats. Again, I'm not going to bore you with how that chart works, but most of those animals were killed, or eaten rather, shortly after they'd achieved their maximum weight. Sometime in their second or into their third year, they were being raised for meat primarily. Again, this is very comforting to me that the data suggests this, because this is how people raise sheep and goats today primarily. Now, moving on to the teeth. Animal teeth form kind of like trees. The enamel starts to form at the bottom, or at the top rather, and then gets thicker and thicker and thicker and thicker before the teeth erupt. And so if we do a chemical analysis at 3 different spots on that tooth, we can learn something about how the diet changed through time, through the first year of life, through the seasons. And we can look at and we can learn about where they lived during that first year of life while the teeth formed. And here's how we collect that data, or here's how we generate that data from samples that we collect. This is a student at MS University in Baroda that helped me this summer. And what he's doing there is he's using a drill, the type that a dentist would use to make dentures, to clean off some of those goat teeth and cattle teeth. This is another student who is helping me do the work, and what she's doing there, that looks like science under the microscope, is drilling those little lines. Then we collect that powder. We put it in samples, or we put it in little jars. We put it into a big expensive machine that goes bing. And we did that with a whole bunch of teeth from those 3 sites. Now, this chart I'm going to have to talk about a little bit because it's important. This tells us something. This is the ratio of carbon 13 to carbon 12 in tooth enamel. High carbon 13 values tell us that these cattle in yellow were eating a lot of C3 plants, which in this environment, the most likely suspects are millets, bajra, actually bajra hay, the stalks of bajra. These lines connect the 3 points from each tooth. So a very short line means that those animals were eating a very similar diet all the way through the year. Farmers were collecting millet hay, bajra hay, and feeding and foddering their animals throughout the year. Again, this is comforting. That's how people raise cattle in Gujarat today. If we compare that to the blue line over here, the goats, you see much longer lines and much lower values. This suggests that they were eating a much more diverse diet that included shrubby C4 plants that were very variable throughout the year. They were taking their animals out into the countryside in different places, in different seasons, and again, that's very comforting because that's the way people raise goats in Gujarat today. The most important thing I want you to notice is look how similar the pattern is at all 3 sites. People were managing both cattle and also goats in a very similar way during the integration era and also during the localization era. So while we have good evidence for there having been a change in climate, farmers seem to have found a way to adapt and raise their animals in a similar way. Turning to mobility, where animals lived, this is a similar chart, but this chart displays the ratio of 2 different isotopes of strontium. Strontium isotope ratios are different in different places across the landscape. It varies by geology. So if there's a very short line connecting those three samples, that means that a particular animal did not move very far in its first year of life. It stayed close to home. If there's a very long line, it means that that animal moved from one geological area to another geological area during its first year of life, more like mobile pastoralism. What you'll notice here is that most of these lines are very, very short. And they all bunch up close together. The archaeological sites are not in the same location, obviously, so there's some variation. If we take a look at this, what we see is that at almost all of the sites, more than 80% of the cattle have very, very short lines. So they're not moving around, most animals are not moving around very much. And the next question is, where were they being raised? Where did they live? And this is the fun part. If you've been dozing, pay attention to this. What we did to figure out where these animals lived is we went around to all these different geological zones. This is a geological map underneath here. And we collected environmental samples from all of those blue dots. And by environmental samples, I mean animal dung. We collected gober because animals eat plants and then mix them all up and deposit them in a nice, neat form for us to collect. This is a student of mine collecting nilgai gober. When we analyze those for strontium isotopes and put it on a map, we can see that they vary across the landscape just like we would expect. And we can look at that same chart that we saw before and see that most of the animals that were consumed at Bagasara, for example, were raised mostly around Bagasara. Some of them have values that are towards the blue area over here, and those animals didn't move around very much. That suggests that there was an exchange or a trade of animals. These bars here are snail shells from that area to show us that those are basically local values. If we map those into space, what we can do is interpolate possible grazing ranges. The yellow are cattle, and what we see is during the integration era at both sites and into the localization era at the third site, there's some differences that I can certainly talk about at some point, but nothing major. Largely the same grazing ranges, and the same goes for goats. There's no major change in the location where animals were raised between the integration era and the localization era. So in sum, during both the integration era and the localization era, cattle and goats were raised for basically the same purposes, grazed on basically the same fodder, in basically the same area. So returning to the research questions that I started with, was the